The city's street was alive with the familiar hum of engines. Footsteps and distant chatter, the kind of urban symphony that most people tuned out as background noise. On that particular afternoon, the sun cast down an unforgiving heat, bouncing off the concrete sidewalks and glass windows, making the air heavy and thick. Crowds moved with purpose, their eyes glued to phones, their thoughts lost in errands, deadlines, and private worries. Among that sea of passers-by, only a few noticed the strange scene unraveling just outside the precinct steps. Two men stood face to face, their difference in demeanor striking enough to halt those who cared to glance. One wore the crisp blue uniform of the city's police force, his shoulders squared with the kind of false confidence born from years of unchecked authority. His nameplate caught the sunlight, but no one cared enough to read it. His stance was wide, chin tilted upward, as if the world itself owed him respect. His buzz cut glistened slightly with sweat, but his smirk didn't falter. The other man stood in contrast, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that hinted at refinement, discipline, and strength. His shoes shined as though polished that very morning, his tie perfectly aligned, his posture unshakable. His skin, dark and rich, gleamed under the sunlight, his presence commanding without needing words. His expression was unreadable, eyes calm and sharp, a kind of quiet that made people uncomfortable because it suggested he saw more than he let on. The uniformed officer stepped closer, a venomous curl at the edge of his lips. He leaned in, his tone mocking, laced with a brand of hostility that was all too familiar in a city where power had been abused too often. Then, without hesitation, he did something that made even the casual onlookers gasp. His lips parted, and he spat ugly. Wet sound cutting through the air straight onto the chest of the suited man. The spit splattered against the fine fabric of the man's jacket, staining it with the kind of insult that words couldn't quite capture. Gasps erupted around them. A woman walking by clutched her child's hand tighter, pulling him along quickly, as if to shield him from witnessing something vile. A man holding a newspaper froze mid-step, his mouth parting as though he wanted to say something, yet no courage surfaced. The air changed instantly. The black man looked down slowly, his gaze fixed on the wet stain spreading across his chest. His hand didn't move to wipe it off. Instead, his eyes rose with deliberate calm, inch by inch, until they locked. Onto the officers, there was no fire in them, no outrage, no sputtering defense. There was something else, something far more dangerous to a man like the officer. It was control. That silence, that unwavering stare, tightened the air more than any shouting match ever could. It was the kind of silence that unsettled, that shifted the power balance without warning. People on the sidewalk stood still, watching, waiting, sensing that whatever was about to unfold was bigger than a petty street confrontation. The officer, mistaking silence for submission, sneered louder. "People like you don't belong here," he said, his words dripping with arrogance. He puffed his chest, planting his boots firmly on the pavement as though staking his claim to territory. "This is my precinct. You think you can just walk in here looking like you matter? You don't. Not here." His words echoed louder than intended. Perhaps he wanted the crowd to hear. Perhaps he wanted the man before him to shrink, to back away, to confirm the power he thought he had. But the suited man didn't move. He didn't blink. He stood his ground, brushing no spit from his jacket, letting it sit there like a mark of disgrace not his, but the officer's. The officer's. Smirk faltered for just a second, but he recovered quickly, shifting on his feet. He wasn't used to this kind of response, or rather, the lack of response. Most men would have shouted back, maybe even swung a fist, giving him the excuse to escalate, to show off his authority. But this man wasn't giving him that satisfaction. The crowd began to murmur. A teenager holding a skateboard whispered to his friend, "Man, this dude's crazy. He just spat on him. You don't do that." The friend shook his head, eyes locked on the suited man. "Yeah, but look at him. He's not even mad. He's just standing there. That's scary." Finally, the suited man lifted his hand. Slowly, deliberately, he adjusted his tie, smoothing it against his chest. brushing the edge of his jacket as though preparing for something greater than this petty act. Then he took a single step closer to the officer. The space between them shrank, and though the officer was taller by an inch, in that moment he looked smaller, weaker. The suited man leaned just slightly forward, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear, yet it carried with a weight that silenced even the murmurs. "You'll regret that." 3 words. Simple, soft, but heavy enough to make the officer's smirk twitch into uncertainty. The kind of words that burrowed under the skin, that left a man awake at night wondering what they truly meant. The officer chuckled, forcing bravado back onto his face. But his eyes betrayed the flicker of doubt. The suited man straightened again, his posture tall, his expression calm. Without another word, he turned his gaze away from the officer and toward the precinct's heavy doors. He stepped past him, unhurried, carrying himself with the kind of composure that came from a man who knew exactly who he was and exactly who the officer wasn't. The officer stood frozen, caught between pride and a gnawing unease he couldn't shake. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, though their whispers lingered. Some shook their heads in disgust, others smirked knowingly as though they had witnessed the beginning of something the officer couldn't see yet. Inside the suited man's footsteps echoed against the tiled floor of the precinct lobby. Each tap of his shoes a reminder that he had walked through worse storms than this. He didn't wipe the spit from his jacket. He didn't need to. That stain wasn't his to carry, it belonged to the man who had spat it. And though the officer didn't know it yet, those 3 quiet words, "You'll regret that," were not a threat, they were a promise. The city outside returned to its rhythm, cars honking, people rushing, life moving on as if nothing had happened. But for those who had seen it, the spit, the silence, the stare it, was an image they wouldn't forget. A white officer, dripping arrogance, and a black man, unshaken, steady, walking into the precinct like he owned it. And maybe, just maybe, he did. The officer lingered on the steps longer than he intended, shifting uncomfortably as the heat pressed down on him. His bravado from earlier began to cool, replaced with something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Doubt. He didn't know why the man's silence unnerved him more than a shouting match would have. He didn't know why those 3 words echoed in his ears louder than the city around him. All he knew was that, for the first time in years, he felt like the one on the outside looking in, and he had no idea just how true that was. The air inside the precinct carried a weight that day, heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves knew something was shifting. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and the worn leather of duty belts, the kind of scent that never left a police building. Phones rang, typewriters clacked from the older desks, and officers moved about in a rhythm they'd repeated for years. Yet beneath all the routine, a tension buzzed low and steady, because everyone who had been outside, who had seen what happened on the steps, carried the image with them. A white officer in uniform, spitting on a black man in a suit, and that black man standing like a storm held in silence. Some tried to keep their heads down, burying themselves in paperwork or phone calls, but their eyes betrayed them, flicking up every time the doors at the far end of the lobby creaked open. Others whispered in pairs, their voices low, but their words sharp. "Did you see it?" He didn't even move. One officer muttered to his partner, shaking his head. Didn't even blink. The partner, older and wiser, simply grunted. "That's a dangerous kind of man." The officer responsible strutted in a few minutes later, his boots striking the tile floor like a drumbeat, meant to command attention. He still carried himself with arrogance, though a piece of his earlier bravado had wilted in the shadow of those 3 words. "You'll regret that." He repeated them over and over in his head, trying to laugh them off, trying to convince himself that the man in the suit was just some nobody trying to look important. But deep down, he felt a knot tightening in his gut. He noticed the sidelong glances from his colleagues. He mistook them for admiration, as if they approved of what he had done, but the truth was different. Most of them weren't impressed, or unsettled. They had all seen men lose their tempers, seen insults fly back and forth in the heat of the moment. But something about the calmness of that suited man, about the way he carried himself without raising his voice, had planted unease into their bones. It was then that the intercom crackled overhead, the captain's voice echoing across the precinct. All units, report to the briefing room immediately. Mandatory assembly. The announcement was unusual. Mandatory assemblies were rare and usually reserved for emergencies or major changes. Chairs scraped, papers were abandoned, and conversations were cut short as every officer filed toward the large briefing room. The buzz-cut officer smirked, still convinced the day belonged to him, still believing he held the upper hand. Inside the briefing room, the atmosphere thickened. The space was large enough to hold the entire precinct staff, walls lined with old photographs of past chiefs, men in stiff uniforms staring out from a different era. Rows of metal chairs filled quickly as officers sat shoulder to shoulder, the sound of shifting belts, holsters, and radios filling the silence. Some leaned forward, whispering guesses about why they'd been called in, while others sat stiff and straight, sensing that something important was about to unfold. The buzz-cut officer leaned against the wall near the back, arms crossed, his grin wide. He thrived on moments like these, where eyes might fall on him, where he could soak up attention and twist it into his own narrative. In his head, he replayed the spit, the way it had dripped down the man's suit, convincing himself it had been a show of dominance that others admired. He didn't realize that he was the only one still smiling. Then the door opened. Every head turned. The room went utterly still. And there, stepping into the room with a stride so measured, so deliberate, that it silenced even the whispers, was the same man from outside, the one in the black suit, broad-shouldered, eyes steady. His presence filled the room before he even spoke. He didn't need to raise his hand or clear his throat. The officers straightened instinctively, as if something in their training told them this was a man to stand for. Boots pressed flat to the ground, spines stiffened, conversations evaporated. The suited man stood at the front, his gaze sweeping slowly across the room, pausing on faces but never lingering too long. When his eyes finally reached the officer at the back, the one who had spat on him, the officer shifted uncomfortably. Against the wall, he told himself it was the heat of the packed room, but deep down he knew it wasn't. The captain, standing at the front, cleared his throat, his voice carrying a nervous edge. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today marks the beginning of a new chapter for this department. As you all know, the city has been undergoing a review of law enforcement leadership. After long deliberation, changes have been made, changes that will affect every one of us." He paused, glancing toward the suited man beside him. "Allow me to introduce your new leader. This is Chief Marcus Hale. Effective immediately, he is the chief of police for this precinct, and he will be overseeing all operations moving forward." Words dropped like a bomb. Whispers exploded around the room, some shocked, some excited, some nervous. Eyes darted between Marcus Hale and the officer at the back, and slowly, realization spread. The man humiliated on the steps the man spat on was not some random stranger. He was the new chief. Chief Hale didn't flinch at the murmurs. He let them rise and fall until the room grew quiet again, until the weight of silence returned. Then he spoke, his voice deep, steady, each word carved with purpose. "This department has a reputation.
Old.
Some of it earned, some of it poisoned by arrogance, corruption, and hate. I didn't come here to preserve what's broken. I came here to fix it." He let that sink in. No one dared interrupt. "I don't care how long you've worn the badge," he continued, scanning the room. "I don't care how many cases you've closed or who you think you are in this building. If you wear this uniform, you represent something greater than yourself. And if you think that badge makes you untouchable," he paused, his eyes finding the officer at the back once more, "leave now." The silence that followed was suffocating. Not a chair squeaked, not a cough escaped. Officers shifted uncomfortably, but no one moved for the door. Everyone knew the words weren't empty. They were a warning, a promise. The buzz-cut officer's stomach turned. His once proud grin had completely vanished. He felt every eye in the room burning into him, knew they all remembered what he had done, what he had said, who he had spat on. His chest tightened as shame crept in where arrogance once lived. But he couldn't move. He couldn't speak. Stayed frozen, praying Hale wouldn't call him out directly. praying the moment would pass. Chief Hale continued, pacing the front of the room with the calm precision of a man who had commanded before, who knew the power of silence and timing. I will demand more of you than you have been asked for in years. Not because I want to make your jobs harder, but because the people outside these walls, the ones we serve, deserve better. They deserve officers who protect, not officers. Who abuse, they deserve law, not chaos. His words echoed in every ear, stirring something deep, something many had long buried under years of routine and silence. Some officers looked down at their hands, ashamed. Others sat straighter, as though a spark had been lit within them. For the first time in a long time, the precinct felt the presence of real leadership when Hale finally stepped back. Folding his hands neatly in front of him, the room was silent. The weight of his words hung heavy, but in that silence was also a strange kind of hope, a sense that things might finally change. For one man, however, that hope was suffocating. The officer at the back could feel sweat bead at his temples, sliding. Down beneath his collar, he had spent years building himself up as untouchable, hiding behind his uniform and his badge. But now, standing under the gaze of the man he had spat on, he realized for the first time that the badge wouldn't save him. He told himself it was just another boss, just another man with a title. But deep down, he knew it wasn't true. Hale wasn't here to play politics or to pad his resume. He was here to tear down the very foundation of arrogance that men like him had thrived on. And as the whispers of Chief Hale spread through the room, the officer understood one thing with chilling clarity: his days of hiding behind a uniform were numbered. The days that followed Marcus Hale's appointment were unlike anything the precinct had ever experienced. Change didn't come quietly, rolled through the halls like thunder. Unsettling, cleansing, forcing everyone to confront truths they had long ignored. For years, the precinct had operated in a haze of complacency. Reports had been filed half-heartedly. Discipline had been more of a suggestion than a rule. And the blue wall of silence had protected too many men who had no business wearing a badge. But Chief Hale wasn't a man who tolerated shadows. He dragged everything into the light. From the moment he stepped into his office, he dismantled the old ways. Case files that had gathered dust were pulled and reviewed. Officers who thought their paperwork would never catch up to them suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Complaints from citizens, once dismissed as noise, were investigated thoroughly. Marcus Hale walked the halls daily, not hidden behind an office door, but visible, approachable, his presence both inspiring and intimidating. His silence alone demanded respect. For the rank-and-file officers who had grown tired of watching their department rot from the inside, Hale was a godsend. They found themselves standing taller, performing better, feeling pride in their uniforms again. For those who had abused their positions, those who had spat insults, bent laws, or hidden behind arrogance, Hale was a nightmare they couldn't wake from. No one felt the pressure more than the officer who had spat on him. Every shift became heavier, every glance from a colleague sharper, every whisper in the break room a reminder of his humiliation. He had once been the kind of man who strutted into the precinct as though he owned it, who barked orders at rookies, and boasted about teaching lessons to anyone who crossed him. But now he was just a man haunted by silence. Chief Hale never mentioned the incident. He didn't bring it up in meetings, didn't call the officer out publicly, and that silence was far worse than open punishment. It gnawed at him, made him paranoid, left him flinching whenever Hale's eyes passed over him in a briefing. He began to lose sleep, lying awake at night, replaying the scene on the steps, imagining the judgment in the eyes of his fellow officers. He tried to tell himself it had been a mistake, that he hadn't known who the man was, but deep down, he knew that wasn't the point. The uniform demanded respect not for rank, but for humanity, and he had spat on that. Weeks passed, and the officer's mask of arrogance began to crack. He snapped at colleagues, made mistakes on routine calls, and drank more heavily after shifts, trying to drown the gnawing shame. Every time he walked past rookies, he heard the whispers, "That's him. That's the one who spit on the chief." Every time Hale stood at the front of the briefing room, his voice calm and commanding. The officer felt smaller, weaker, like a man shrinking inside his own skin. Finally, one evening, after a particularly grueling day, he could take it no longer. He marched to Hale's office, his heart pounding, his palms damp. He told himself he was going to defend his actions, maybe even demand forgiveness. But the truth was that he was desperate to be acknowledged, desperate to be freed from the weight of silence. He knocked once, hard and without waiting. For an answer, pushed the door open. Marcus Hale sat behind his desk, reviewing reports. The office was neat, orderly, not decorated with trophies or personal clutter. Just clean lines, organized stacks of paper, and the presence of a man who valued discipline. Hale looked up slowly, his gaze steady, calm. The officer felt his throat tighten. "Chief," he began, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it firm. I need to talk to you." Hale set his pen down, leaning back in his chair. He didn't speak. He didn't invite him to sit. He simply watched, waiting. The silence pressing harder than any words. The officer shifted uncomfortably, wringing his hands. "Look, I didn't know who you were that day. I didn't mean well. I didn't mean for it to go that far. It was a mistake." Hale's eyes narrowed slightly, though his expression remained calm. "You didn't need to know who I was," he said evenly. "That's the problem." The officer blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Hale said, his voice measured, firm. "Respect isn't earned by a title or a rank. It's given because it's right. The man you spat on could have been a lawyer, a doctor, a janitor, or a stranger walking down the street. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you showed exactly who you are." The officer swallowed hard, shame rising like bile. "Please," he stammered. "I've served here for years. I've put in the time. I've made sacrifices. I lost my temper." Hale stood slowly, his full height casting a shadow over the man. "You didn't lose your temper. You revealed your character. And this precinct deserves better than that." Ailser's knees felt weak. Ailser's needs still turned to Ems, to defend himself. But the words dried up in his throat. He had nothing. He knew Hale was right. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Give me another chance." For the first time, Hale's expression shifted just slightly. He leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "This precinct will not be poisoned by arrogance or hate. You had your chance the moment you wore that uniform. You lost it when you decided it made you untouchable. Consider this your last day in it." The officer's chest collapsed. He opened his mouth to protest, but Hale had already turned back. To his desk, dismissing him without another word. The conversation was over. The verdict had been delivered. Stumbling out of the office, the officer felt every pair of eyes on him. Some were cold, others indifferent, but a few carried a glimmer of relief. Relief that the rot was being cut out, that the silence was ending. He had once been feared, but now he was nothing more than a cautionary tale. As he packed his locker, his hands trembling, rookies whispered nearby, their voices carrying just enough for him to hear. "He thought he was untouchable," one said. "Now look at him." He wanted to scream at them, to remind them of his years of service, of his arrests and citations, but he couldn't. All he could see was the stain of his own arrogance, the spit against a black suit that had marked the beginning of his end. Meanwhile, Marcus Hale continued his work. He didn't gloat, didn't celebrate. He simply moved forward, reshaping the precinct one day at a time. His speeches reminded officers of their duty, his actions held them accountable, and his presence gave them a standard to rise to. Slowly, the department shifted. Complaints from the community dropped. Trust began to rebuild. Officers who had once dragged their feet now carried themselves with pride, in the break room, in the briefing room, in patrol cars across the city. A new phrase began to circulate whenever someone needed a reminder of the standard they were now held to. Respect, or you don't serve. It became more than words, it became culture, and the story of the officer who spat on the new chief spread like wildfire, not just within the precinct but throughout the city. It was told to new recruits during training, whispered in locker. rooms and recounted by veterans as a lesson in humility. He became the ghost of arrogance, a man remembered not for his years of service, but for one moment of disrespect that defined his downfall. For Chief Hale, that was enough. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need to stain his leadership with personal vendettas. The officer had written his own ending the moment he chose to spit. Hale had only given it closure. One evening, as Hale stood at the front of the briefing room, he addressed his team once more. His voice was calm, steady, unwavering. Power isn't in the badge. It never has been. Power is in how you treat the people around you. From this day forward, we serve with dignity, or we don't serve at all. The room erupted in applause, not forced, not polite, but real. Officers clapped with conviction, their eyes alight with pride. For the first time in years, the precinct didn't feel like a fractured building weighed down by old sins. It felt alive, felt whole. Marcus Hale stood tall, not as a man who had won a victory over one officer, but as a leader who had restored honor to a uniform that had been tarnished for too long. And as for the officer who had spat on him, his name faded from memory, but his story remained a lesson passed down through generations of officers. The man who thought his badge made him untouchable until respect demanded otherwise. The end.